What happens when a billionaire walks up to Alex just moments after her Cincinnati Open draw is confirmed and instead of talking about tennis, tells her something that could change the way the entire tournament sees her? Why would the owner of a $260 million tennis transformation pull aside a 21-year-old Filipina star? And why does the fact that his own daughter could eventually face Alex make the conversation even more unexpected? Because this was not a normal welcome, it was not a routine handshake, and according to the story surrounding that private moment, then Navarro had already reached a conclusion about Alex that went far beyond her ranking, her recent victories, or even the possibility of another breakthrough. He believed Alex had become something bigger than a player, but there was one detail that made his message almost impossible to ignore. The tournament had just been transformed into one of the most ambitious venues in tennis, and now the man who had poured an enormous personal fortune into that transformation was looking at Alex as one of the faces of its future. And if you think that sounds like an exaggeration, wait until you understand what was happening around her before she even stepped onto the Cincinnati court. Alex had barely arrived, and already the pressure was building. The Cincinnati Open was no longer simply another stop on the calendar. It had become a statement, a gamble, a massive bet on what tennis could become in Mason, Ohio. Navarro had chosen to invest heavily in a tournament that could have moved elsewhere. Bigger cities had opportunities. Charlotte had interest. Chicago had obvious potential. But instead of abandoning Cincinnati, Navarro doubled down. The result was staggering. The Lindner Family Tennis Center had expanded from roughly 20 acres to more than 40 new courts were added. A 2,300-seat sunken stadium became part of the complex. A huge player clubhouse was introduced. Indoor facilities were expanded. The tournament itself had evolved from a one-week event into a 12-day spectacle, and the player field had grown dramatically. This was no small renovation. It was a declaration that Cincinnati belonged among the biggest stages in tennis. And then came Alex. That timing matters, because the tournament did not just need new buildings, it needed moments, it needed stories, it needed players capable of making people care about what was happening inside those new walls. And Alex had already shown that she could create something very difficult to manufacture: genuine emotional connection. Toronto had provided the clearest evidence. The source story describes crowds of thousands of Filipino fans gathering to watch her, with the atmosphere becoming so intense that the venue was compared to Little Manila. Tickets connected to her appearances were reportedly disappearing incredibly quickly. Suddenly, the equation was different. Alex was not simply another name in the draw. She represented a community, a country, and a rapidly growing audience that had discovered a player they desperately wanted to see succeed. Navarro understood that a billionaire who understands the business side of sports does not look only at rankings. He looks at attention, he looks at loyalty, he looks at what happens when a player walks onto a court and people who might never have watched that tournament before suddenly feel that they have to be there. Alex had that effect, and that is where the private conversation becomes so fascinating. Imagine the moment the draw has been announced. Alex knows she has received a first round bye. She knows she is seeded. She knows the tournament is massive. She knows the US Open is waiting around the corner. She has already experienced the sudden acceleration of her career. But then the owner approaches her personally. There are no roaring crowds in that moment, no match point, no camera following every movement. Just a private conversation, and the message attributed to Navarro was extraordinary. You are the story of this tournament. Think about those words for a second. Not good luck, not welcome to Cincinnati, not I hope you enjoy the facilities. The story says Alex was told that she was the story that changes the emotional weight of everything around her, because Alex was walking into a tournament that had been built to showcase the very best players in the world, yet somehow the attention was beginning to move toward her, and there was another layer that made the moment even more complicated. Navarro's daughter, Emma, was also part of the tournament conversation. She was highly ranked, seated, and potentially on a collision course with Alex deeper in the draw. So the person expressing admiration for Alex was not just any tournament executive. He was also the father of a player who could potentially stand across the net from her. That makes the gesture more interesting. It suggests that whatever Navarro saw in Alex was bigger than his family connection to the competition. He was looking at her as a player, but also as a phenomenon, and perhaps that is exactly why the moment mattered. Alex did not arrive in Cincinnati with nothing to prove. Quite the opposite. She had already endured the difficult transition from promising young talent to Someone carrying real expectations. Her rise had accelerated her first WTA title, had changed the conversation around her. Her Wimbledon run had given her another major milestone. Her ranking had climbed suddenly. Every tournament came with a different question. Can she do it again? Can she handle the attention? Can she beat players who have been living at this level for years? Can she turn one breakthrough into a sustained career? Those questions follow every young player who rises quickly, but Alex was dealing with another force that most players never experience at the same scale: the expectations of an entire nation and diaspora when thousands of Filipino fans show up for you. The support is incredible, but support can also create pressure. Every cheer reminds you that people are watching. Every photograph becomes part of a larger story. Every loss feels heavier because people have emotionally invested in the journey, and yet Alex kept moving. That is perhaps the most revealing part of her story. She did not seem interested in becoming distracted by the noise. She had something much simpler to do: play tennis, stay focused, keep fighting, prove she belonged. And now Cincinnati was offering her perhaps the biggest stage, yet the financial stakes alone were enormous. The source material describes a women's prize pool of roughly $7.43 million, with hundreds of thousands of dollars available as the tournament progressed. But the money was only one part of the equation. Ranking points were just as important. With the US Open approaching, every victory in Cincinnati could change the shape of Alex's next few weeks. One win could mean a little more confidence, another could mean a deeper run, a deep run could mean a major ranking boost, and a major ranking boost could change who she faces, where she is seated, and how the tennis world views her heading into the final Grand Slam of the season. Suddenly, the tournament was not merely about what happened in Cincinnati, it was about what Cincinnati could unlock next. That is why Navarro's words carried so much weight. He had spent a fortune creating a stage. Alex was arriving at exactly the moment when the stage needed a new story, and the contrast was almost cinematic. Behind her stood a gigantic physical transformation: new courts, new buildings, new player facilities, a vastly expanded campus. In front of her stood a completely different kind of challenge. Could she transform attention into results? Because crowds do not win matches. Hype does not win points. A packed stadium can make a player feel unstoppable for 5 minutes. But tennis eventually reduces everything to one question: what happens when the ball comes back? Alex knew that, the people around her knew that, and perhaps Navarro knew it better than anyone. That is why the conversation cannot simply be viewed as praise. It was also a challenge. If you are told you're the story, you have to decide what kind of story you are going to write. Alex could have been overwhelmed by the attention. Instead, the story suggests she chose the only response that made sense: stay focused. That mindset had already carried her through moments that could have broken her momentum. She had gone from being a young player with potential to becoming someone people expected to win. That transition is brutal because expectations arrive faster than experience. Suddenly, opponents study you differently, crowds react differently, media coverage changes, even ordinary mistakes can become part of a headline. But Alex kept climbing, and Cincinnati offered her another opportunity to prove that her rise was not a temporary flash. There was also something symbolic about the tournament itself. Navarro had reportedly invested heavily because he believed Cincinnati could become something much bigger than it had been. He could have chased the obvious solution and moved toward a larger market instead. He believed the existing tournament could be transformed. The same philosophy was beginning to surround Alex. She was not the obvious superstar. When this journey started, she was the player who had to earn every step. She had to build recognition point by point, tournament by tournament. And now, the person responsible for transforming one of tennis's major events was recognizing the transformation happening inside Alex's career. That parallel is impossible to miss. Cincinnati was rebuilding itself. Alex was rebuilding the expectations around what a Filipino tennis player could accomplish. One transformation was made of concrete, steel, courts, and buildings. The other was made of confidence, victories, pressure, and belief, and both were arriving at the same place at the same time. But then came the question nobody could ignore: what if Alex actually made a deep run? What if the crowds grew even louder? What if she reached the later rounds? What if she faced Emma Navarro? Suddenly, the private conversation between the tournament owner and Alex would take on an entirely different meaning. It would no longer be a nice story behind the scenes. It would become part of the tournament's central drama: the owner's daughter against the player he had publicly recognized as a major Attraction: a young American star against a rising Filipino phenomenon, two players from the same generation both carrying enormous expectations, potentially meeting on a stage that had just been rebuilt for moments exactly like this, and that possibility was enough to create another layer of suspense, because tennis does not care who owns the tournament, it does not care how much money was invested into the venue, it does not care how many people traveled to watch. Once the match begins, the court becomes brutally simple: one player wins. One player loses, every point erases the previous point, every reputation has to survive another rally, and Alex had earned her place in that environment. That may be the real meaning behind Navarro's message. He was not saying she had already conquered Cincinnati, he was recognizing that she had become important enough to matter before the first ball was struck. There is a huge difference, and perhaps that distinction explains why the moment resonated so strongly. Alex did not need someone to promise her victory, she needed confirmation that the world was beginning to see what she had been building toward. The girl who once had to fight simply to be noticed was now being treated as someone capable of changing the atmosphere of a major tournament. That is an extraordinary shift, and it happened incredibly quickly. Just look at the sequence: of first WTA title, a deep Grand Slam run, a rapid rise in the rankings, a massive Filipino following, crowds gathering around her, major tournaments recognizing her marketability, then Cincinnati, then a first-round bye, then a private conversation with the tournament owner, and then those words, "You are the story of this tournament." Each development raises the stakes for the next. That is why the Cincinnati chapter matters. It is not isolated, it is another step in a much bigger transformation, and the most fascinating part is that Alex still had not reached her ceiling. She was only 21, she was still learning how to manage pressure at this level, she was still figuring out how to turn extraordinary moments into consistency. The tennis world had already seen flashes of what she could become, but flashes are not enough. The next stage is sustaining them. That is where legends separate themselves from surprises. Alex was standing at that exact crossroads. The attention had arrived. The fans had arrived, the money was there, the ranking points were there, the stage was there. Now came the hardest part: delivering when everyone expected her to, and perhaps that is why the billionaire's message mattered. It was not just recognition, it was a reminder that expectations had changed. Alex was no longer sneaking up on the tennis world. The tennis world was now watching her, waiting for her, talking about her, building stories around her. The challenge was no longer convincing people that she belonged. The challenge was showing them how far she could go. As she prepared for Cincinnati, the renovated courts around her represented more than an upgraded facility. They represented ambition. Navarro had looked at the old tournament and decided it could become something extraordinary. Alex had looked at her own career and done something similar. She had refused to accept the limits people might have placed around her, and now those two ambitions collided in one tournament. The owner wanted Cincinnati to become a destination. Alex wanted her career to become a legacy. The fans wanted another unforgettable moment, and the tennis world wanted to know whether the phenomenon could keep rising. That is what made the Cincinnati Open so compelling. The question was never simply whether Alex could win her next match. The bigger question was whether this was the beginning of something much larger. Could the player who had already created Little Manila in Toronto bring that same energy to Cincinnati? Could she turn a first-round bye into a deep run? Could she carry the expectations of Filipino fans while competing against the best players in the world? Could she continue climbing before the US Open? And perhaps most intriguingly, what would happen if the draw eventually put her across the net from Eala Navarro, the owner's daughter, the player who could turn a private conversation into one of the most emotionally complicated matches of the tournament? There would be no room for sentiment, then no private words, no billionaire standing nearby. Just two young stars and a tennis court. But before any of that could happen, Alex had to do what she had always done: stay calm, stay hungry, keep fighting, because underneath all the headlines, the massive crowds, the prize money, the rankings, the renovated stadiums, and the billionaire attention, there was still a young woman carrying a racket and trying to solve one point at a time, and that may be the most powerful part of the entire story. The world around Alex was getting louder, but her job remained quiet. Watch the ball, move your feet, trust your shot, fight for the next point, then do it again and again until the noise disappears, until the pressure becomes fuel, until the impossible starts looking normal. The Cincinnati Open was built to announce a new era. for the tournament, but Alex arrived carrying the possibility of announcing a new era for herself, and when the owner of that newly transformed stage looked at her and reportedly said she was a story. Maybe he was not predicting what would happen next, maybe he was simply recognizing what had already happened. Alex had become impossible to ignore. The fans had already proven it, the rankings had started to reflect it, the tournaments were beginning to understand it, and now the owner had said it directly, but there was still one thing nobody could know in that moment: how far could the story actually go? Because if Cincinnati was the stage, Alex had not come there to admire the stage, she had come to play on it, and if the pressure was bigger than ever, so was the opportunity. The $7.43 million prize pool was waiting, the ranking points were waiting, the US Open was waiting, a potential showdown with Navarro was waiting, thousands of fans were waiting, and somewhere behind all of it was the quiet memory of a private conversation that began with a billionaire pulling Alex aside and ended with a sentence that suddenly made the entire tournament feel different. You are the story of this tournament. Maybe that sentence was praise, maybe it was a prediction, or maybe it was a challenge, but one thing was certain: once those words were spoken, Alex could no longer walk into Cincinnati as just another player in the draw. She walked in as someone people were waiting to see, someone people had traveled to support, someone a billionaire tournament owner believed could become part of the event's identity. And that is where the story becomes bigger than Cincinnati, because Alex's rise was never really about one tournament, one trophy, or one ranking number. It was about watching a player move from possibility to belief, from belief to expectation, and from expectation towards something that could eventually become history. The girl who once had to introduce herself to the tennis world was now walking into a transformed stadium with an entire audience already knowing her name. The tournament had rebuilt its home. Alex had rebuilt her own ceiling, and both were about to find out just how far that new beginning could go. The private conversation was over, the cameras moved on, the crowd eventually turned its attention to the matches, but the words remained. And perhaps that is why this moment mattered so much, because sometimes the biggest turning points in sports do not happen during match point. Sometimes they happen quietly away from the crowd, when someone who has seen the entire picture tells a young athlete something she may not fully understand until much later. Alex was told she was the story. The only question left was whether she would become the ending everyone remembered or the beginning of something much, much bigger. I can also create a high-actor thumbnail concept or image for this Cincinnati Open.